Hello everybody, this is Dr. Willow Ariala coming to you to redo Chapter 4. Alright, some highlights from the exciting chapter of non-experimental methods. Woohoo! Okay, non-experimental methods. So the authors discuss how the qualitative information that we covered in Chapter 3 is also non-experimental. They describe the methods in this Chapter 4 as non-experimental because they have a more narrowly focused research problem and they can use statistical procedures to analyze the data. So, you know, they're differentiating between qualitative and other methods as non-experimental, but it's an okay point to make, but don't get hung up on it. For the purposes of the class, the authors and your quizzes will probably separate the two, but in general, in the field of research, non-experimental studies or methods are when you're not trying to look for a cause and effect in your independent and dependent variable. So generally speaking, that's how most people think about it. So descriptive methods. Descriptive methods are called that because they do not involve the manipulation of any variables, and you can only speculate about causation. So that means that you're not trying to prove that X causes Y or X could have a big influence on Y. And they talk about different sources of information. So they mention archival and previously recorded. The General Social Survey is a big survey that a lot of people use because it has a lot of participants, and you can do quite a bit with 35,000 people's responses. Archival and recorded information is also called secondary data. And they mentioned some of the problems with using secondary data. So sometimes you don't know exactly who left the information. They mentioned a graffiti example. In my undergrad, in an English class, I did a paper on bumper stickers. So graffiti bumper stickers is the same kind of thing. You don't really know a whole lot about bumper stickers or graffiti because it's most likely not a representative sample, and you can't really know for sure why they wrote what they wrote and who decided to write what they wrote. So there are, you know, a lot of challenges with using some secondary data, not all of it. I think what they're really referring to are, you know, observations in the environment more than the General Social Survey. I mean, that's what I would say. The graffiti example to me is more about making observations or noting what you've observed in the environment, not so much about the General Social Survey as a potential problem. But I have a question for you, critical thinking question. Why do researchers care about generalizing results? Because I mentioned your ability to make statements other than those that merely describe your data is severely limited. And this textbook and other research textbooks will say over and over again about the generalizability of your data. So why do we care about that? Why is that important? And they mention selective deposit on page 61. Again, I think they're referring more to not General Social Survey kinds of things, but more like you know, case study pieces of information, historical information. For example, there's a Kinsey Research Institute, and they have a lot of documents from Kinsey and his colleagues, and some of it would be have the problem of selective deposit, because maybe he or some of his colleagues destroyed some aspects or some parts of their you know, notes or observations or data. Comparisons with the experimental method. So again, we're not controlling any of the variables, and so you can't make any type of cause and effect statement, and all you can do is speculate. So you use your critical thinking skills and you speculate about what might have been going on with the graffiti or the bumper stickers or whatever. And they make a point, and I want to reinforce, that this type of research can yield interesting and valuable results, and that is very true. All research methods can yield interesting and valuable results if they are done well. That's the key. Naturalistic observation. So collecting sometimes numerical data, answer some more focused questions. And they mentioned using one-way mirror so that others can't see you observing them. And that has to do with the Hawthorne effect, which I mentioned in an earlier video. And so the participant observation, or having your participants know that you're observing you, can affect the results. And this is another reason why deception may be appropriate. We talked a little bit about that in discussions with some of the students, and in your textbook with the ethics component. There are times when deception can be appropriate, and you know, IRB groups would approve deception. And then again on page 63, they mention conducting an experiment in which researchers manipulate variables is only one of many legitimate techniques used to gather data. So the authors are reinforcing, and I'm reinforcing, you know, all methods have their value. I think maybe, I don't know, I'm just guessing, one reason why they're saying this over and over again is because the qualitative non-experimental methods have been debated for their validity and reliability and their value by some kind of hardcore experimentalists. And as you saw, the history of psychology was experimental studies. So that may be one reason why the authors are saying that over again. A second reason for using naturalistic observation is as an adjunct to the experimental method, and I think that's a good point. And I think I've mentioned this before in videos. So sometimes you do a particular kind of study, a case study, for example, and then from the case study, you can't generalize that, but you can take certain aspects of that case study and say, I'm going to investigate this part of it, this small part of it, a little bit more, and then you could do, if you wanted to, and if it made sense to, an experimental study where you manipulate variables. So people can do this and do this. So they do a qualitative study, gather information, learn about that, start formulating a possible theory or other hypotheses, and then they can test it using an experimental method or other kinds of methods. Choosing behaviors and recording techniques. So I want to emphasize that they mention a great deal of planning has to take place. This is true with any research project. You've got to, it entails, all research done well entails a lot of planning. And the authors of the text mentioned in one of the earlier chapters a plan that you could try to, you know, implement to see if it works for you. But it's true that research requires a great deal of planning, and very little of it, if any, should be left to chance. So you've got a lot of decisions to make. We talk about time sampling, situation sampling, and whether or not you're going to present your results in a qualitative or quantitative manner. If you have a qualitative approach, then your information is going to be presented in a narrative as opposed to, say, you know, pi square and, you know, probabilities and things like that. And then, of course, if you're using non-experimental methods, then you should avoid, as an observer, making speculative comments. So you want to look at the data and only try to use the data to derive your information, as opposed to your biases or your own thoughts. They describe inter-observer reliability, and this relates to the 3 criteria mentioned on page 51. So in qualitative research and non-experimental research, the more people that you can get to agree on things, the percentage of agreement is important. It helps with credibility along with reliability. They ask at the bottom of page 65, what is a good measure of inter-observer reliability? They mentioned 85%. I don't know. How do you think they came up with 85%? They mentioned that's a guideline. So where do you think they got 85%? Critical thinking question. They mentioned correlation studies. So correlations, we're looking to see if 2 variables, sometimes more than 2, but 2 variables, looking to see if they are related somehow. So as one variable increases, study time, as you increase your study time, does GPA increase? Those 2 are positively correlated. A negative correlation, also called an inverse correlation, is where one variable goes up. So say drinking alcohol goes up, GPA goes down. So as one goes up, the other goes down. And to be, to say that they're related, you have to have a fairly high number. That number, what it is varies in the field, and people have opinions about correlational numbers and which ones are good, strong. But so you have a scale from -1 to +1 on reliability, and you'll learn more. On correlations, and you'll learn more about correlational numbers later on. 0 correlation, so just means that the variables are not related at all. Like this said, is a correlation is 0.03. That's pretty much 0. Again, a reminder, correlation does not imply causation. Just because one variable goes up and another one goes up, or one variable goes down and another one goes down, does not mean that one causes the other one. It's a very important point. They mentioned an example in here about excuse me, telephone poles in Australia, and after World War II, and the yearly birth rate, and there's a high correlation there, but that doesn't mean that telephone poles in Australia causes higher birth rate in the U.S. So you can prove a lot of things are related. That one increases and the other one increases, or vice versa. That doesn't mean that one's causing the other one. I remember in college, one of the funny examples that I was told about, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like, researchers have found that as shoe size increases, IQ increases, or something like that, and so big feet causes geniuses, or something. But it's a joke because they aren't bigger feet don't cause, more smartness or whatever. So you have to be careful on cause and effect in anything but experimental studies. Ex post facto studies. That's when you look at 2 variables after the fact. And so they provide a good example of that. Surveys, questionnaires, tests, and inventories. They say one reason surveys and questionnaires are popular is that they appear to be quite similar to conduct, and although they're not specifically differentiating surveys and questionnaires, and a lot of people don't, survey research is actually a little bit different than questionnaires. It's a fine, settled detail. You can learn more about it later. But they appear to be simple to conduct, and I appreciate their point. Appear to be quite simple, and they really aren't. It's easy to slap together a bunch of questions, but that doesn't mean that they are good questions, that they're really going to provide you with some valuable data. So there are some important considerations in creating questionnaires, and they make a point where you They strongly encourage you to exhaust every possibility before you attempt to construct your own questionnaire. And I highly agree with them. Constructing good questions on a questionnaire is not easy. And some people spend a number of years testing questionnaires, pilot testing them, and using the other methods, the split test information. So it is a difficult thing to design good ones. The purpose of your research project will determine the type of survey or questionnaire you choose to administer. Again, that is reinforced. Your research question always drives your method. And they mentioned pilot testing. They mentioned developing a good survey or questionnaire. That it can take years. The steps on page 72 in Table 4.1 are appropriate steps for developing them. They mentioned you need to consider the reading level of the people that you think will be taking the questionnaire. Good point. Try to avoid using questions that might bias or prejudice respondents' answers. Also a very good point. That the one that they have in the box on the bottom of page 73. Very poorly worded question. Very poorly. I know I've taken many, completed many questionnaires where I hated some of the questions, and you probably have too. Sometimes the questions are created well, and we still don't like them because we're still forced to choose an answer, and occasionally the answers don't have good, good responses that we would like to answer them. So it can also be the answer choices. Demographic data, that is typically the information that we generally know about people. And researchers usually want to collect this kind of information for just about every study. Age, sex, income, socioeconomic status, class, ethnicity, geography, that kind of stuff. They talk about mail surveys, and they have a low return rate. They mentioned that it's not uncommon to have a response rate from 25 to 30%. And 50% are considered quite acceptable. I find that number unusual. In my review of the literature on this, response rates of 20% were considered common. And I was at a conference not too long ago where a woman was talking about her response rate, which was only 14%, and her advisors thought that that was a good response rate. That number surprised me. So I think it's more common to have a 20 to 25% response rate. It's difficult though. When I did my master's thesis, my participants were my fellow and sister MSW students in the same cohort that I was in, and I didn't mail the surveys out to them. We had boxes at the time, little mail boxes in our college school of social work, and I put surveys in each of their mailboxes, and they just had to walk a few feet to put it in an anonymous location in a box that I hardly ever saw. So I wasn't standing there. I don't know, maybe some people were concerned about that. I don't know, had to speculate about that. But the questionnaire took about 10 minutes, and after about 2 weeks or so, I put surveys in the questionnaires in all the boxes again with a little note saying if you hadn't completed it, please do. And then I think I did a third round, and I had a pretty low response rate, and that wasn't even from the mail. I think out of 400 students, I had 170. It was, it was fairly low, and I was surprised. So getting them back in the mail is even harder. Then they talk about additional mailing. So like an additional mailing, I put an additional questionnaire in each student's box. And then they discuss personal interviews. They have their pros and cons like every method. They discussed how personal interviews can introduce the possibility of an interviewer bias, and that is a problem. I had to deal with this in the interviews that I conducted, and I could not control for it with the interviews I hired and trained. So with the women in the battered women's shelter study that I did as part of my research for my dissertation, I hired and trained other researchers to interview the women, a section of the women, sample of the women, and I had no idea, what they were saying in those interviews. I couldn't control for their sentence inflection or their nonverbals, or putting an emphasis on something that I wasn't intending. So you do all you can in a research project, and then at some point you just have to let it go. Then they talk about telephone interviews, tests and inventories. They're a little bit different animals, tests and inventories. They talk about characteristics of good tests, and validity and reliability are important in just about every research study, so it's not just about tests and inventories, but validity. Are you actually measuring what you want to measure? So say you want to find out if a certain population has low self-esteem or depression. You don't want to be measuring one and actually measuring the other one. So self-esteem and low self-esteem and depression can go together sometimes. So you have to design a good questionnaire or instrument to make sure you're measuring one and not the other one. And then they discuss different aspects of measuring validity. So you have overall validity, and then you have different types of validity: content validity, concurrent validity, criterion validity. So there are several ways to test for validity, and those are important when you're using questionnaires, especially, as well as other kinds of research. So validity, are you measuring what you're intending to measure? And then reliability is, do you get consistent results? So if you test people and you get a result, is that result really reflecting what those people actually said? And so there are some different procedures that people can use to test for reliability, consistency. So the test, retest, and the split half are tests for reliability. And again, those are tricky, can take quite a while to do the reliability. And that's one reason why it's really, really helpful if you find somebody else's questionnaire where they've already done this work, where they've already done the validity testing and the reliability testing, because these things take a long time. And that's usually why you have to purchase those, because conducting all of these tests for validity and reliability can take years. So people, rightly so, charge for them. Achievement tests. So, you may have done an achievement or an aptitude test. Achievement tests are typically things like, passing a state exam after you've earned your degree. An aptitude test. So, I give these quite regularly as an advisor at my college, where I want to help people figure out what they want to do with the rest of their life. And so some people have never done career exploration, and so there are different kinds of career exploration tools. One of them is called the self-directed search, developed by a man, and I'm still forgetting his name, who's spent over 40 years of his career doing research on aspects of personality related to satisfaction in careers, and then personality tests or inventories, getting a sense of who people are. And then they talk about sampling considerations and research strategies. So sampling, what is a sample? How do you get a good sample? Why is sample important? I also want to say that they mention population and sample, and they mention random sample. Random sample, random in science, does not have the same meaning in everyday language or how people generally use that word. So random in science means something pretty different than, say, oh, I just chose that dessert at random. That's not random in science. Getting a random sample involves statistical processes. So you want to be clear about those differences. And so they go through some of the ways to get a sample and ways to get good samples. And basic research strategies. So they discuss single strata, cross-sectional, longitudinal, and cohort. And there are your research drives which one you choose. Again, the research question always drives whether you're going to gather data from a single stratum of population, whether you're going to get